Thank you so much for coming to our museum lecture. This is our fall event. We always have during York Fest, different speaker to highlight the museum, and also we have an event in the spring. I want to just kind of tell you about briefly. It's March 18th. We'll have a dinner, and some of you that come to this fall event also come to the spring dinner that we have, fundraiser for the museum. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Jared Pack. I could tell you a lot of things about him, and I will tell you a couple things about him. Got his bachelor's degree from Freed-Hardeman in 2012, his master's from University of Arkansas in 2014, and his PhD in history from the University of Arkansas in 2019. Dr. Pack is a blessing to our campus. You may know some people who are passionate about history. If you haven't met him yet, you'll know by the end of tonight. He probably tops that list of people who are passionate about history and actually passionate about everything that he does. He just has an exciting personality. His wife Karen is here with us, and they have two children. Ben is 9 and Annabeth is 3 years old. And so without anything else to say, I'm going to introduce to you Dr. Jared Pack.
Good evening. In 306 CE, the Roman Emperor Constantius I, Augustus of the West, died while in York, not this York, leading a campaign of the Roman army against the Britons. At this point in Roman history, the empire was governed by what we call the Diocletian Tetrarchy, which is a pretty complicated way to talk about a four-man group made up of two emperors who governed one half of the empire each, the Augusti, and two Caesars, their junior colleagues and presumed successors. Within this tetrarchy, Constantius held the title of Augustus of the West, the ruler of the western half of the Roman Empire, the part that you probably think of when you think of the Roman Empire. And as he was dying, he informed the army that his son Constantine should be named Augustus, despite Constantine not technically being in line for the position. The army, having fought under Constantius, quickly obliged the request, lining up behind Constantine and proclaiming him the new emperor and Augustus. In the years that followed, a power struggle and series of wars broke out within the empire as Constantine faced challenges from the other members of the Tetrarchy. Severus in the west, Galerius, Maximin, and Licinius in the east, and Maxentius in Italy, who the others refused to recognize as even a legitimate contender in this fight. This civil war would rage on from 306 to 312, resulting in the consolidation of power by Constantine in the west. Severus was captured and died in 307. The death of Galerius in 311 left Maximin and Licinius both in control in the east. By 312, all that stood in the way of Constantine's consolidation of power and taking his position in Rome as the emperor was Maxentius and his army that had moved into Italy. On the 28th of October, 312 CE, Constantine I faced Maxentius just north of Rome and the Tiber River at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. There, despite being outnumbered, Constantine was victorious over Maxentius and his men, forcing them to retreat. As they did, many of them, including Maxentius, drowned in the Tiber River as they frantically rushed back toward Rome. Yet for Constantine, this unlikely victory was far from a fluke. According to the ancient historian Eusebius, Constantine had already come to be a believer in the God of Scripture. Constantine is recorded to have prayed to the supreme God for help and assistance in battle. He prayed that whoever this God might be, he would reveal himself to Constantine. And according to Constantine, God did just that. After praying this prayer, While marching in the middle of the day, Constantine and all of his men saw a cross of light appear in the sky. Alongside the cross were the words, "In hoc signo vinces." In this sign, conquer. For Constantine, this was the sign he had hoped for, the sign he had anticipated and longed to see, the assurance by God that he would be victorious. The next night, Constantine claimed that Christ had appeared to him in a dream, telling him that this symbol of the cross should be his standard in war. The next morning, the emperor ordered his craftsmen and soldiers to put the Chi symbol, a Christian cross symbol of the ancient world, symbolizing the Christ through a monogram-style use of the first two letters of the name Christos on their standards. These standards, or labarum, featured the Christogram at the top and a cross below that would display a banner of Constantine. This would not, however, be the last of Constantine's dreams. He's recorded to have had another dream the night before he faced off against Maxentius at the Milvian Bridge. That night, Constantine claimed that God spoke to him, instructing him to paint the Christogram on the shields of his soldiers. When he awoke, he instructed all of his men to quickly paint the symbol onto their shields as he had been told. Thus, as Constantine and his men marched into battle that October day, they did so under the banner of the victorious Christ and were led to victory as a result of God's divine favor. Or so the story goes. While Constantine will not officially convert to Christianity until his baptism on his deathbed, it is certainly true that these encounters represent a dramatic moment of conversion in one way or another in the life of Constantine. Through the years, historians and scholars of Christianity have gone back and forth over the various accounts of Constantine's conversion story and his victory over Maxentius. It's certainly true that ancient historians did not necessarily abide by the same, we'll call them standards of the discipline, that I and my colleagues across the country and world use today with regard to things like evidence, sources, and accuracy. Even still, this story has endured, not in the least, because it corresponds to a much broader change in the attitude toward Christians by the Romans under Constantine. It most certainly seems that even if Constantine failed to fully understand the implications of following the Christian God when he first encountered the conquering sign of the cross, his moment of conversion would have a tremendous impact and bearing on not only his own life, but the lives of Christians for centuries to come. What I hope to do tonight then is examine the one where Constantine converts. And if you've been following our Yorkfest theme, you'll know that's the best title I've ever come up with. I want us to think about some important questions. What does Constantine do for Christianity? What does he not do? What are the impacts and legacies of such actions? And how do we score those as we look backward with the benefit of historical hindsight? I hope that in attempting to deal historically and at times theologically with the conversion of Constantine the Great, that we can indeed develop a clearer and better sense of the immense impact he's had on the development of the Christian faith, even to the present. Yet before we can begin to ask those hard-hitting and controversial questions about the impact of Constantine, we first need to ask, what is it that Constantine actually did? In this regard, the answer to this question requires a bit of separating fact from fiction. In dealing with the historical record as it happened and the way that history is preserved and passed down through collective memory, frequently what can happen with history and memory is that one version or of an account can get slightly changed or simplified, and then as that version of the historical narrative is passed down and repeated enough, it eventually becomes part of the collective memory. In the case of Constantine, I believe that's what's happened. Many people know the story of Constantine's famous vision of the cross. They know his changes to the empire's policies on Christianity. They know that Constantine himself may have been a Christian, although in reality he isn't baptized until he's on his deathbed. And they then state that Constantine made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. Unfortunately, that's simply not true. Christianity will not become the official religion of the Roman Empire until 379 or 380, under the reign of Theodosius I. In the 40 plus years between the death of Constantine and the proclamation of Theodosius I, the empire split again after Constantine's reunification, with 11 different emperors ruling at least part of the Roman Empire. That's a lot of different things and a lot of different emperors to happen between Constantine and the recognition of the Christian faith as the official state religion. So right off the bat, we need to acknowledge that Constantine's impact on Christian faith was not the result of making Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. So, now the question becomes, if Constantine did not make Christianity the official religion of Rome, well, what did he do? Fair question. Almost immediately upon gaining sole power in the West, Constantine, in conjunction with his rival turned co-emperor Licinius, announced in 313 the Edict of Milan. Now, we first need to probably acknowledge that the Edict of Milan was not actually, well, an edict. It was not a formal official order or proclamation from the emperors. Rather, it was two letters sent out from the two Augusti, one addressed to the governor of Bithynia and posted in Nicomedia, the eastern capital of the empire, and one posted in Caesarea that was written in Greek. Regardless of whether or not it was an edict, however, the letter did emphatically state, "This, therefore, is the decision that we reached by sound and careful reasoning. No one whatever was to be denied the right to follow and choose the Christian observance or form of worship, and everyone was to have permission to give his mind to that form of worship which he feels to be adapted to his needs, so that the deity might be enabled to show us in all things his customary care and generosity." Now, this statement has been regarded as a transformational moment in the life of the church, in that it legalizes Christianity and officially ends any persecutions that the Christians may have faced. Certainly, the words we read just a moment ago speak to that sentiment. Yet this is also a somewhat inaccurate statement, because by the time the Edict of Milan is issued in 313, Galerius, the former Augustus of the East, had already proclaimed a legalization of Christianity as he was on his deathbed 2 years earlier in 311. Having realized that his persecution of Christians had failed to achieve its desired aims of ridding the empire of a group that were perceived to be disloyal troublemakers. Additionally, Constantine had already stopped persecuting Christians within his realm in the West. So this statement of policy in 313 about the legalization of Christianity is less an announcement of a new policy and more of a declarative statement to the regional governors that the new Augusti intend to basically keep following the current policy. Now, that's not to say, though, that the Edict of Milan doesn't do anything new for Christians. It most certainly does. The letter from Constantine and Licinius goes on to announce that any property that had belonged to Christians and was seized, sold, or given to someone else must be returned back to the Christians without any expectations of compensation or repayment. Such property was to be handed over immediately by energetic action on your part without any delay, the Augusti wrote. Furthermore, this provision not only included churches and houses of worship, it also included any other property that belonged to the, quote, whole body of the Christians. This proclamation that was issued regarding the restoration of church property would have a tremendous effect on the church, in that it gave back to them much of what had been lost in the preceding 240 years of official persecution at the hands of the Roman Empire, and promised a certain measure of rapidity with which it was to happen. The seriousness with which the emperors meant this policy can clearly be seen in their offer to those who were giving land back to the church to seek indemnity from the imperial treasury. They were told that if they gave land back, they could reach out and appeal to the Augusti for compensation. This policy was clearly not mere lip service. Thus, what we see in the Edict of Milan is that while Constantine may not have actually done anything new in legalizing Christianity, he did ensure its legality continued, and he made a significant step in offering Christians legitimacy by the free return of any and all property that had been seized from the churches throughout the Roman Empire during the years of persecution. Well, while the Edict of Milan may have very well been the first thing that Constantine did that would have an effect upon Christianity, it certainly would not be the last. One of the things we have to acknowledge about Constantine's official support of Christianity is that regardless of any other factor with regard to his views on faith, he certainly believed that Christianity could be a positive force for the empire. Constantine believed that Christians had a close-knit community that, if brought into the fold of the empire, could potentially help bring about national unity. As such, Constantine was appalled to discover the ways in which Christians were divided among themselves, which any of you who have ever been part of a church should not be surprised by. It was in this context, then, that he will attempt to bring about a unity of belief and agreement within the Christian faith through the famous Council of Nicaea in 325. In 324, the year before the council, Constantine had become sole emperor of Rome and defeated his former co-emperor Licinius, who was imprisoned and then at Constantine's order executed. That's also a small problem for how we judge Constantine's faith, but we don't have time to talk about that problem tonight. This meant that for the first time since the creation of the Diocletian Tetrarchy way back in 293, Rome had been governed by one emperor. Yet upon taking over the eastern half of the empire, Constantine soon discovered that the church in the east was deeply divided over the teachings of Arius, a presbyter of the church in Alexandria. Arius had recently begun to push back against the Trinitarian nature of God, arguing that Jesus was not co-eternal with God and was not inherently sinless because he was a created being. In this regard, Arius taught that Jesus was the Son of God, a title and honor bestowed upon him, but that he was not God in the same sense of God the Father. This teaching resulted in Arius being excommunicated from the church by Alexander, the Bishop of Alexandria. I know that's a lot of Alexanders going on in this sentence. By 324 then, this controversy had spilled well beyond Alexandria, as bishops and church officials throughout Asia and Africa had begun to take sides in this debate. The issue was so significant that it drew the attention of the emperor, who in 324 attempted to settle the dispute personally. He wrote a letter to Arius and Alexander, urging them to be reconciled to one another, although he noted the excommunication was still going to be intact. Well, despite the emperor's direct appeal, such resolution of the issue would not occur. When an even more anti-Arian bishop was elected in Antioch the next year, the stage was set for an empire-wide showdown, as other bishops were soon excommunicated for sharing in Arius' beliefs. It's in this context, then, that in 325, Constantine called a meeting of the church bishops from throughout the empire in May of 325 at the city of Nicaea. This meeting was composed of more than 200 bishops who were brought to Asia, housed and fed on the emperor's dime, and reflecting the interest of Constantine. The event was held in an imperial building The opening session was chaired by Constantine himself, which is rather ironic considering that he wasn't even a baptized Christian. But again, small details. As Constantine opened the session, he expressed his firm belief that in the same way his victories over his enemies had brought peace to Rome, this meeting would bring peace in the Church of God. While Constantine will not directly manage the council in its entirety, it is certainly clear that from the very start, all parties involved were aware that the emperor wanted the Arianism debate ended once and for all. Over the next 2 months, the council debated and considered an adoption of an official stance on the doctrine of the church that would put to rest the Arian dispute. The council ultimately decided rather quickly that the teachings of Arius were heresy. But deciding upon an official creedal statement of faith was much more difficult. Eventually, Eusebius of Caesarea, the famous church historian and later biographer of Constantine, offered his own version of a statement of doctrine, an effort to clear his own name and reputation since, well, he had previously also been a supporter of Arius. By the end of the council, it would be Eusebius's creed that would be adopted by the bishops with near unanimity. It read, as you see on the screen, "We believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and of all things visible and invisible. And in one Lord, Jesus Christ, the Son of God, the only begotten, begotten of the Father before all ages. Light of light, true God of true God, begotten, not made, of one essence with the Father, by whom all things were made, who for us men and for our salvation came down from heaven, and was incarnate of the Holy Spirit and the Virgin Mary, and became man. And he was crucified for us under Pontius Pilate, and suffered and was buried. And the third day he rose again according to the Scriptures, and ascended into heaven, and sits at the right hand of the Father. And he shall come again with glory to judge the living and the dead, whose kingdom shall have no end, and in the Holy Spirit." For those of you familiar with the Nicene Creed, you may recognize that this statement is not exactly what we would call the Nicene Creed. That's because the creed will be amended at the Second Ecumenical Council in Constantinople in 381. Again, small details. Nevertheless, this statement will prove to be the basis of Christian orthodoxy all the way to the present. It's worth noting, however, that this creed does include one direct addition from Constantine himself, at least according to Eusebius. The word homoousios, which in English translates to this phrase, "of one essence," or "of one substance." I'm sorry, I meant to turn that a different color in the text. I'm just remembering I was going to do that right now. For Constantine, this was a direct repudiation of Arianism and a clear message that divisions of such kind would not be acceptable. Now, the Nicene Creed would also go on after this doctrinal confession to list off several anathemas that were explicitly in repudiation of his views of Arius and his views on the deity of Jesus. Ultimately, the Council of Nicaea will come to a close with a large banquet of all the bishops, hosted by the emperor to celebrate Constantine's 20th anniversary of assuming the throne. As all the bishops returned home, Constantine took great satisfaction in his role in brokering peace within the church and his empire by resolving the great theological debate of the day. Unfortunately for Constantine, however, that peace would not last. And both Arianism and other problems would soon again rack the church. Nevertheless, the Council of Nicaea becomes a defining moment in not only the realm of theology, but also for what it shows us about the connections between church and state under Constantine. Speaking of Constantine's direct interest in the church, the final thing Constantine does that I'd like to highlight is his massive financial and social support of Christianity through the construction of churches. Constantine undertook a lavish building project for churches, often funding these ventures from the treasuries of the pagan temples in the empire. Such efforts led to a massive way of building and the building of some of the most famous churches in the world. The original St. Peter's Basilica, which you see here in the middle. Now, this one will be replaced in the 1500s by the current St. Peter's Basilica, but this one will endure from the days of Constantine for over 1,000 years. He will also be responsible for the building of the church of the original Church of the Nativity, part of which still stands in Bethlehem, and the original Church of the Holy Sepulchre. This is Constantine's original design here. You can see its progression through the years in the diagram moving from bottom to top. Although all three of these churches built by Constantine will either be completely or partially destroyed and replaced by new churches several hundred years later. Constantine also built the Church of the Eleona on the Mount of Olives, the Basilica of Constantine in Trier, Germany, which is the one you see here, and a number of churches in his newly constructed capital city of Constantinople, including the Magna Ecclesia, or the Great Church, on the site of what will eventually become the Hagia Sophia. In addition to building many of these churches to commemorate holy sites within the Christian faith, Constantine also revolutionized the nature of church architecture. Throughout the 3rd century, most Christians would have met in churches that resembled homes. From the outside, the architectural style would have been similar to a typical Roman domestic lodging. For Constantine, however, it was important that these churches be magnificent structures, but also that they not be modeled after the pagan temples of the day. As such, he chose a relatively new style of the basilica to be the model for the churches he built, with their large interior spaces, as you see here, and impressive designs, generally featuring a semicircular apse on the one end of the building. You see the rounded space here. In doing so, Constantine not only gives official sanction to churches, but he also converts churches into architecturally significant sites rather than unassuming buildings dotted within residential lots. Yet all the things we've discussed, the conversion of Constantine, the Edict of Milan, the Council of Nicaea, the state-funded construction of churches, warrant the question that still remains in our time together. How do we evaluate the Constantine effect? What changes were actually wrought by Constantine? And how do we score his impact upon the development of Christian faith? This question is perhaps the trickiest of all for us to answer, because, as is often the case in history, things are not always cut and dry. And historians and scholars disagree wildly on the answer to this question. Almost immediately, some historians began to extol Constantine's ascension to the throne and his Christian faith as the greatest thing to ever happen in the history of the church. In his large volume History of the Church, Eusebius records these words: "Thus all tyranny had been purged away, and the kingdom that was theirs was preserved securely for Constantine and his sons alone. They, having made it the first task to wipe the world clean from hatred of God, rejoiced in the blessings that he had conferred upon them, and by the things they did for all men to see, displayed love of virtue and love of God, devotion and thankfulness to the Almighty." Clearly, Eusebius regarded the victory of Constantine and his reign over a united empire to be the true mark of a devout follower of God. Of course, we must be careful to solely take Eusebius' words on the matter, since Eusebius was certainly trying to court the favor of the emperor and was a personal friend of Constantine. Perhaps then, such effusive praise is not the entire answer to the legacy of Constantine. So, if evaluating the legacy of Constantine means we should be skeptical of the immediate praise offered by his personal hype historian, then perhaps a better starting point would be to ask exactly what does change because of Constantine. To start, at the very least, the Roman Empire became what I will consider religiously neutral. Now, this may seem a bit strange, given that we've not shied away so far from accepting Constantine's Christianity as a legitimate manifestation of faith, even if also a very pragmatic political move at times. Historically speaking, though, Constantine's Edict of Milan, importantly, does not make the Roman Empire Christian. In fact, it stops well short of that. Constantine did not repress traditional religion. And at times it seems that he very intentionally left space for traditional polytheistic religious practices to operate alongside Christianity. Constantine was keenly aware that the majority of his empire was not Christian, and that it would not be possible to move toward wholesale adoption of the Christian faith. You see on the screen here 2 different sets of coins. Both of them feature the Emperor Constantine on the front. The first one features the sun god on the back. The other is going to feature Constantine's standard with the Cairo symbol at the top. It certainly seems that by promoting essentially a religious neutrality, Constantine created a space in which many would eventually convert to Christianity in some form, but on their own terms. More than that, though, Constantine understood that religious toleration and freedom of religion was essential to the unity and common good of his empire. Despite all the persecution of Christians had endeavored to achieve over the preceding 240 years, it had failed. It had failed to rid them. It had failed to bring peace and unity to the empire. He could not expect a legalization of Christianity to have any different result. Constantine understood that if peace was the goal, then freedom to worship as each person saw fit was essential. Because what Constantine realized was that in reality, neither society nor social space, neither public life nor the space in which it takes place, can actually be religiously neutral. People were going to have religious preferences, and Constantine needed to make space for that if peace was going to occur in his empire. Second, when we think about the impact of Constantine, it is most certainly clear that Christianity will become imperialized. While Constantine may have been attempting to create a space free of religious imposition, the practice and look of Christianity will be shaped by the connection to the empire. Dr. Michael White observes, quote, "With the conversion of Constantine, it's a very significant change, and the change is one we can see in several stages. What is originally a movement oppressed by Caesar because it's a competitor eventually becomes a cult of the Lord Christ by the time we get to the late 1st and early 2nd century. With the conversion of Constantine, however, it becomes an imperial religion. Now, Jesus had been transformed into the Lord Christ of heaven, and Constantine, the emperor, ruled in his name." End quote. It certainly seems that in the mind of Constantine, the Christian God was a God of power. And that vision of an all-powerful and victorious God was attractive to Constantine, who then took his own power and victories to be evidence of the supreme God's favor and ordination upon him. Constantine saw himself as a bishop of the people of Rome, in a sense, a divinely appointed leader who was tasked with leading and guiding those within the empire. As this imperial vision of Christianity and its connection to the empire took hold, it can also be seen visually throughout the empire. In the aforementioned basilicas, we see Constantine co-opt a Roman structure, clearly in use within the empire for civic and judicial purposes, and turn it into a house of worship and honor to God. It's an imperialization of the very site of worship. Similarly, by the end of the 4th century, when the Santa Pudenziana was built as a basilica to honor Saint Pudentiana, it featured what at first glance might seem a fairly typical mosaic of Jesus and his disciples. Yet if you look at this image on the screen closely, what you will notice is that Jesus is in a very elaborate, expensive toga, seated enthroned in an imperial chair, This Jesus looks like the emperor himself. And here he sits enthroned in front of a very elaborate cityscape behind. And it's not the city of Rome, it's the new imperial city of Jerusalem. So Constantine's imperial patronage of the church is reflected in a variety of ways in the rebuilding of Jerusalem, in the establishment of Christian monument, in the place of Christianity in Rome, and in the presentation of Jesus in his disciples. You also see this right in the two women who are in the background, who are to be Mary, the mother of Jesus, and Mary Magdalene. Yet they both appear not as first century Jewish women, but as elite Roman women. Now, Jesus and his followers look like the Roman aristocracy. They are a part of the mainstream of Roman society. This is an imperial Jesus. Certainly then, the Christianity practiced under Constantine featured a uniquely imperial spin and flair. Third and finally among these changes, though, is perhaps the most significant of them. While Constantine did not force conversion, his imperialized religion still had a tremendous impact upon Christianity within the Roman Empire. Because while it may not have been the official religion, it was nevertheless the religion of the emperor. The result of this was what one scholar calls the baptism of Rome. Constantine was shaping his empire through his laws, his prohibitions on sacrifice, and slowly but surely the empire was being transformed into something new. As this happened, though, Christianity also became vogue. And as it became popular, it adopted hordes of new converts whose faith was weak at best. To be a Christian was now, in theory, a matter of fashion rather than fear. To be a follower of Christ was not to be a devotee of a socially repugnant cause, but to share the faith of the emperor himself. What Constantine set in motion was the beginnings of a gradual process of Christianization, a wide-ranging and overt assimilation of Christian symbolism and culture into the identity of the Roman Empire. This will inevitably mean that the nature and composition of Christian communities will change. And as it does, the church and Christian faith will begin to look different. So what do we make of these changes? What do they mean for how the Christian faith develops? Well, historically speaking, for most of the last several centuries, historians and scholars of Christianity have looked at the impact of Constantine and regarded it as one of the most damaging things to ever happen to the Christian faith. Scholars like John Howard Yoder will mark the reign of Constantine as the beginning of the fall and apostasy of the church. They argue that once Christianity becomes fashionable, large masses of people were converted. And as a result, the moral standards of the church decrease as ambitious and unscrupulous men sought church office because of the social and political influence it allowed. These scholars argue that Constantine opened the door for paganism to creep into the church. They note that Constantine claimed the title Pontifex Maximus, which was the title endowed upon the emperor under the old state religion of its polytheistic gods. And that same title will later be passed to the popes. They cite the introduction of some pagan feasts and holidays as newly rebranded church festivals. Additionally, these critics will look at Constantine's building projects and argue that such things were distraction, as ornamental buildings began to substitute for what the church was really supposed to be, a group of people devoted to one another and following Christ. The anti-Constantine contingent will also look at the Council of Nicaea to argue that Constantine and the state exercised strong control over church matters, with the church and its bishops having been co-opted into state functionaries. For many, the sum total of these arguments is that Constantine destroyed the church that Jesus had intended. The church that emerged from Constantine's imperialization they contend, was so far from the church of the first century that it was hardly recognizable. More recently, other scholars, like Peter Leithart, have begun to push back against this narrative. Leithart and others are quick to acknowledge that while Constantine's Christianity may not have been perfect, there is a matter of murdering a co-emperor, one of his children, and his second wife. That while his Christianity may not have been perfect, his impact upon the Christian faith and his style of governing clearly reflected a faith that was more than just pragmatic political consideration. Under Constantine, the Roman Empire abolished crucifixion. Infanticide was repressed. Gladiatorial contests were discontinued. The treatment of slaves became more humane, and Constantine seems to have been the first ruler to legislate against the rape of slaves by the master. Constantine even went so far as to hail the work of granting freedom to your slaves as a deed of piety that was pleasing to God. Indeed, Leithart argues that, quote, Constantine's legislation was frequently driven by a concern to protect the rights of the forgotten little people of the empire from the venality of officials, the burdens of landlords, the petty manipulations of the wealthy and powerful. End quote. For Leithart, Constantine's efforts with regard to the Council of Nicaea and the other divisions within the church were not efforts to control the church, but rather were attempts to pursue unity as brothers and heal the divisions between them. For Leithart, all of this speaks to the way that Constantine envisioned the world. His argument might best be summed up this way, and I quote, by eliminating the civic sacrifice that founded Rome and protecting and promoting the Eucharistic civitas, Constantine was, in effect, if not intent, acknowledging the church's superiority as a community of justice and peace. He was acknowledging, whether he recognized it fully or not, that the church was the model that he and all other emperors should strive to imitate. End quote. These two perspectives on Constantine's impact, then, could not be more different. The former hails him as the great apostate, who is responsible for the downfall of the church. The latter regards him as a seeker and follower of Jesus who is striving to make Rome more like the kingdom of God. Perhaps, though, as I find is often the case, the truth of the matter lies somewhere in the middle of these two black and white suppositions. If we're truly going to consider the impact of Constantine upon the Christian faith, then it's impossible to ignore the ways that the popularization of the Christian faith following Constantine's conversion leads to pagan influences and the introduction of converts who are not interested in the demands of true discipleship. Yet, to leave the discussion there and portray Constantine as the villain solely obscures some significant realities. He ended the general persecutions of the Christians and invested in the growth and expansion of the church. He used his position as emperor to improve the morality of the laws governing his empire, even if it didn't always have that effect. He helped promote clear enunciations of the Christian faith that still form the basis of belief today. The simple fact of the matter is that Constantine, like any historical figure, is complicated and complex. He's flawed and problematic. And that makes it hard for us to look back and provide the types of clear-cut answers about what kind of impact he had upon Christianity. We all like nice, neatly tied bows and easily repeated truisms, but history rarely affords us such a luxury. In the case of Constantine, one thing is clear, and that is whether we think Constantine's identification with the Christian cause was a triumph or disaster. The controversies that surfaced in the churches during his regime only intensified in the generations after his death. Constantine's impact on the Christian faith was indeed great. Thank you.
spot here, but sometimes we have time for questions here at the end. If anyone wants to follow up questions or comments. Are you ready for that, Dr. Pack? Yeah.
Always.
All right, questions? I'll let you back over.
It is known that Constantine's mother was possibly a Christian before him.
Yes.
And she went through, you say Jerusalem or the Holy Land.
Yeah.
And she says she found the cross. She found many holy relics. Is this also true?
Can you start that, Jared?
Or is this, again, a story?
No, that's very much true. What I was going to try to step back, and Jared's going to get me back up on here, and I'll get us to the right slide. So if we go back to this slide, this is actually her depicted alongside him. So this is Constantine, and this is his mother Helena. Certainly, it seems that at least in the case of his decision to build the Church of the Nativity and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, both of those were things motivated and done in response to his mother's own interest in Jerusalem and her visits frequently to the Holy Land. Dr. Roush.
At least an observation you can comment on or not. The Nicene Creed became the standard credo in the Latin Mass that still exists to today when you hear a choral music mass performed. And I just find it interesting that in the Sermon on the Mount, it seems like Jesus only has ways we're supposed to live. And by the time we get to the Nicene Creed, it's only things we're supposed to believe.
Well, that is certainly an interesting dichotomy. In terms of commenting upon that, I will leave those comments to my colleague, Dr. Best, and the Bible department for what that says about the development and understanding of faith and discipleship. Other thoughts? Professor Ming.
Yes, early in Constantine's career, I mean, as a young man, which would have been the late 3rd century.
Yes.
That was the time period of one of the greatest persecutions.
Diocletian.
So, what was his take then, in particular as a young man, because he would have been a part of that, I mean, growing up, and how did people reconcile that? I mean, I can't imagine a bishop that was alive during that time getting this invitation to come by the emperor. So I'm curious at what changed in those probably 20, 30 years or so.
It's hard to say because we don't have great sources from the early life of Constantine. What we do know is that as part of this, his father will be one of the successors to Diocletian in the power struggle that emerges after Diocletian's death. And by that time, Constantine is going to be off waging wars in other places. But what certainly does seem to be true is that Constantine is going to have kind of a reckoning in his life, right, as he begins to seek out the supreme God. Now, there are questions about if Constantine understood fully who the supreme God was, right, because that tends to be kind of the terminology that's used. But I think what we see is that regardless of what we can tell about Constantine's own direct involvement in the persecutions of Diocletian, by 306, when Constantine's father dies, Constantine immediately ends persecution once he's in charge, which is going to be even before the Edict of Galerius, even before seeing the sign, right, which again, right, there's lots of speculation about whether that's true or not, and ultimately we just can't answer that question. But, so Constantine is going to end persecution pretty soon upon taking throne.
So piggybacking on to that, do we have enough sources to tell us the feel among the Romans in charge, if Diocletian's persecution was seen as a failed attempt, something that was harming the Roman Empire as opposed to helping it?
Diocletian himself will say it is. Diocletian will actually end that persecution himself on his deathbed because it isn't working. Right? It's one of his great failures is that he thought if he went all out, it would finally eradicate these Christians. And instead, despite everything he does, it does not. And so that's going to be a critically important thing, right? Galerius is going to do the same thing. Galerius, as he's on his deathbed, is going to issue this edict, right, ending persecutions in 311, because it isn't bringing about the desired result, right? It isn't ridding the empire of them. Christians are remaining strong. They are remaining a force. And so there is some awareness among these emperors that we thought this would do the trick, and it has not. Dr. Kite.
Do you have any idea why the name Constantinople was changed to Istanbul?
That's going to be a reflection of changing hands of the...
Was it a religious thing, I guess I'm asking? Yes.
Yes. It is going to be a religious change that happens when the Ottoman Turks are fully in control. Yeah. I mean, and that'll be around, right, that's also happening alongside, right, the Hagia Sophia being converted into a mosque and other things that are part of the ridding of Constantinople of its Christian heritage and its site and its identity as a Christian site.
So it has nothing to do with Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic?
No. No.
In terms of the size of the Roman Empire, when he's an emperor, is it at its largest or is it expanding?
Ooh, this is a fun question. It is not expanding anymore, and in fact, it is in the middle of decline. Within 100 years of Constantine's death, the western half of the Roman Empire will basically fall. And the move of the capital to Constantinople will generally be regarded as the beginning of that process.
I was just going to add that then you have the interesting Julian the Apostate,
Yeah.
who thinks that the decline is caused because of the Christianization.
Right.
So he tries to turn back to paganism. And I love his letter to Orasius, the high priest in Bithynia. He says, hey guys, we're getting outmanned by these Christians.
That's right. This is a great letter.
And he says they're beating us because they're helping people, they're burying the poor, and we got to up our game. We need to open up some hotels to care for poor people.
Right, because we're losing because the Christians are being the kind of people they claim to be. Yeah, and of course that same argument will then be later picked up by Gibbon in his famous history, The Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire, right? Gibbon will take a similar argument, blaming the decline of the Roman Empire on its Christianization. And modern historians will come in and say, yeah, Gibbon was not a great historian. You should not, under any circumstance, trust this as your definitive text.
Okay, the symbol that Constantine saw, some people say it was a meteor coming down. He saw that and took it as the cross. And, they've also done some research in Italy and found a spot they believe is where the meteor hit, which was close to where this battle happened. But, he saw this in the sky, and it was blazing, it was hot, it's fire.
There are a lot of theories put forward about what Constantine may or may not have seen. Some will argue that it was very possible that marching in battle with the way the light was reflecting, he saw a cross symbol. What is universally kind of regarded, if you don't believe Constantine actually saw a sign, is right. The big problems that generally get cited are, he says he saw words in the sky. And then he says, not only did I see it, but all of my men saw it. And the problem we have then is we don't have any evidence from all of my men. Right? So there's nothing to actually say Constantine didn't see what he says he saw. Furthermore, we're in a society in a time where lots of people across lots of faiths, not just Christian faith, would have believed in signs and things like that. And so, historically speaking, it gets into a game of he said, she said, and we can't definitively answer. So, maybe there is some validity, right, to this idea. Maybe it was a glimmer of light that looked like a cross. Maybe God did indeed reveal a vision to him, words and all, that everyone saw. Ultimately, we just can't know. And as I like to tell my students all the time in history, we do not get to play in the world of wild speculation. We do not get to play the counterfactual and what ifs. It might be a fun thing, but in the world of history, we deal with what wases, not what ifs. One more question. Let's see a hand over here.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, is there any evidence that any of his men saw anything, or more importantly, the other army?
We have no surviving evidence of anything else. In fact, and then some of our sources that record this, right, are guys like Eusebius, who we've already acknowledged as a historian is problematic because it's really hard to take him at face value. Now, it's also hard to score Eusebius. There's been really good work done in recent years that says Eusebius may have also kind of been full of it in claiming that he was a close personal friend of the emperor. Some scholars say that, well, if you look back at it, where they might have been at different times, they certainly had never met before the Council of Nicaea in 325. And even after the council, they would have probably only been together in groups on a handful of occasions. So perhaps we could call him an acquaintance, but buying Eusebius' own claim that he was an advisor and close personal friend of the emperor is perhaps suspect. But that would also explain why he's trying to court divine and imperial favor, right, in writing the way he does. So, hard to say. He also never finishes fully the biography of Constantine. So, lots of things. Thank you all for your questions. Thank you for your time.